Thanks, Ali. We've had many fine speakers here today who are expert in the history of the city and the historic context of the garden squares. My talk today will focus on where historic parks, which include garden squares, sit in the context of a parks and open space strategy for the city, which is currently in preparation. This strategy will be very much informed by my experience over 9 years with Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, where in 2012 we published the first open space strategy of any local authority in the country. So what is the point of an open space strategy? In a time of limited resources, it's important to set priorities which then inform or indeed dictate future expenditure. Priorities can only be established by a considered and critical analysis and auditing of assets, in this case parks, open space and recreational facilities, to identify needs and deficiencies in provision or distribution. It's also important to establish a hierarchy of parks because with literally hundreds of public spaces, it would be impossible to maintain and present each to the same quality or standard. Up to now, the City Council has had an unstated policy of treating every public park and space as the same, and they are not the same. And with greater emphasis on value for money, we need to establish a clear hierarchy, which will be important, I believe, for the future management regime of our historic parks. Strategically, we also want to identify partners and sources of funding for future projects. And finally, we want to propose a plan with clearly defined and achievable actions for change over a 5-year period. An example of the information that can be gleaned from a more analytical approach to what we do. These are the playgrounds, the public playgrounds in the city, mapped on a geographic information system. If you went to any community in the city or did a user survey and asked people what they want, people will always say playground. But we don't have to provide playgrounds in every estate or every road in the city. We just need to make sure we have good quality play facilities within reasonable proximity of where people live. And for this purpose, we're setting a threshold of 800 metres. And when you map that, it gives you a very clear indication of where there might be a deficit of play facilities in the city, and we have identified that, and we're currently acting to construct new playgrounds in areas where there is a clear deficit identified. And I understand there was some discussion this morning about playgrounds. We might come back to that in a few minutes. We also want to look at the hierarchy of parks in the city. From studying other cities and how they've classified their parks, there are no strict rules that can be applied because each city has its own particular geography, natural heritage, and social and economic history, which has framed and formed the provision of public space. Typically in Dublin, we've used terminology such as regional and major to define our most important parks, but this relates more to the size of the park than to the quality of the offering. And many of our finest parks have derived not from the requirements of development plans or through the conditions of planning permissions, but through philanthropy and because of the vision of key individuals in public life. Chris Summers just mentioned there earlier on about the lack of open space in some parts of the city, and he's dead right. There are areas of the city where there's a very identifiable deficit of green space, and that's something we need to act on over the next number of years. And it is that deficit in the city that results in playgrounds being put into the garden squares, which we cherish so much. So if we look at the top level in the hierarchy, we have what we might term the flagship parks. These are the parks where the natural or built heritage is of such quality to constitute not only a valued amenity for the local population, but also an important visitor attraction for tourists. If you or I were visiting a flagship park in any other capital city, you would expect that there would be a certain level of facilities for visitors, such as good quality interpretive information, a cafe, clean toilets, baby changing facilities, perhaps themed gardens, horticultural excellence, and cultural events and activities. This is the quality that we want from our flagship parks. And other than the visitor facilities, these are also the qualities that we want in our Grade 1 parks. There are also other hierarchies within the scheme, which I don't need to go into now, but they will be set out in more detail when we publish our strategy for public consultation. So if we look at the individual parks, arguably the most important heritage park we have is one of natural heritage. The Bull Island, a very special place and quite unique to have this quality of wildlife spectacle so close to the capital city. While we talk about getting a designation for George and Dublin, the Bull Island actually has a UNESCO designation as a biosphere reserve. And a biosphere is something, it's not like a wilderness up in the mountains where nobody lives. The easiest definition is the place where there's a high level of biodiversity, but it's also a place where people live, there's a local economy, and there's recreation also. The conservation designation on the Bull Island goes back to the 1930s. It's got every designation possible. But more recently, in the Seville strategy and the Madrid action plan from UNESCO, there's a focus much more on these urban biospheres, and the Bull Island is one which we want to promote much more under that heading. So we have developed a project to promote the Bull Island, to promote this designation, and even to look to extend the designation. And we're also looking at developing the visitor facilities there in terms of what would be required of a flagship park. These are the other flagship parks, I suppose, in the city. And I've included the ones from the Office of Public Works here. And you can see, if you go down through the list, you'll find some of the historic parks and garden squares included here. Now, some of them would be of a flagship level in terms of offering them and promoting them as a visitor facility. Others would be more of a community level where they're used by the local community, but they would still be maintained to the same high standard. Just going back to the theme of tourism, while built heritage has always been acknowledged as being important for tourism, from recent research there is much more appreciation of the value of natural heritage to the tourist industry. And just some statistics that I picked up here, the Botanic Gardens being the second most visited free attraction in 2012, and surprising the numbers of visitors who visit gardens there in 2011. So the value of our historic parks to contribute to the overall tourist offering in the city, I don't think should be underestimated. We have been busy progressing conservation studies for each of our historic parks as a starting point to assess the fabric of each park, to understand what is important from a conservation perspective and what opportunities there are to enhance their general presentation and to make the kind of interventions and improvements that we referred to earlier for visitors. If you look at Merrion Square here, we have commissioned a conservation study which we hope will be ready before the end of the year. I have no doubt it will be. We've commenced the restoration of some of the follies from the Lord Ardilaun estate out in St Anne's. That was from a conservation study that was done some years ago. St Patrick's Park, we will be doing a conservation study there in 2013, but we also have plans for a cafe there which will be in place by next summer. The conservation plan for Herbert Park, again in 2013, and we've proposals for a cafe there also, but it's not a historic building. Palmerston Park, we have a conservation study there almost complete. We'll be publishing that this month. Mountjoy Square, we're working with the Mountjoy Square Society there to procure services for a conservation plan. Harold's Cross is pretty much intact, but we're also looking at developing a cafe there for next year. At Dartmouth Square, we have a conservation plan which has been completed, and we'll be launching that this month. And Pearse Square is an historic park. It's restored to an original design, and that was restored back in 1990. Looking ahead, the biggest problem from my perspective is not funding. Because even though we all know there isn't the same monies available, I firmly believe the good projects will find funding. And in reality, the cost of what we want to achieve is not exorbitant. In-house resources are not a problem because despite the trials and tribulations of cutbacks, redundancies, etc., we still have a dedicated team who want to achieve things. The biggest problem I foresee is dealing with public expectation, establishing trust and creating an understanding with communities and interest groups as to what is achievable and in what timescale. Unfortunately, there is a lack of trust in local government that we will not do the right thing or we will not keep to our commitments. On this issue, I would just like to highlight the credentials of the Park Service to deliver on best practice conservation and improvements to historic parks. But just looking at Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, I programmed and led a range of improvements to historic parks and historic infrastructure. The bandstand and sun shelter on the East Pier, the obelisks on Killiney Hill and Stillorgan. And as well as that, we developed a lot of visitor facilities within Cabinteely, Marley and Killiney Hill, where we developed tea rooms and toilets. And that's actually a very good model for public toilets, is to incorporate them into a cafe or tea rooms, because then they get managed as part of that and you don't end up with your typical municipal toilet block. And sometimes you need a longer term horizon for projects. The People's Park in Dún Laoghaire, there's about 3 million being spent this year on the promenade, but also on the tea rooms and the pavilion. James Howley reminded me there that it was 10 years ago that we did the conservation study for the tea rooms and the pavilion. So it does take time sometimes for these things to come through to fruition. But I'm pretty sure that if we had not proceeded with the conservation study, procured the design, and got through the planning process, I don't believe that work would be underway today. So it's an example of a good project finding funding, but sometimes it does take time. And that may well be the case in some instances in the city. And one such case is Mountjoy Square Park in the North Georgian Quarter, which has been referred to earlier. In 2012, the City Council carried out a user survey in the park, and over 260 people were interviewed. And the findings were interesting. While over 90% of the people expressed a strong affection for the park, almost 50% of those interviewed were not Irish. No one mentioned heritage, and the most serious issue was antisocial behaviour. So the challenge for us is to work with these diverse ethnic community interests so that they gain an understanding of the value of this heritage and the benefits that would accrue to their communities by the implementation of a conservation plan. On this project, as I said earlier on, we're working with the Mountjoy Square Society, and Karen gave a great talk there earlier on. And Karen has done a lot of research herself, and we've agreed a direction in which to pursue the conservation and possible restoration of this very important park for the city. However, that is not to say there are not very difficult issues to resolve around the use and layout of the park because of the diverse resident communities and the interventions and changes which have occurred to the park over time. This may be a slow burner of a project, but I'm optimistic that we can achieve significant short-term gains and put a long-term plan in place. So partnership is very important for us to achieve the objectives which will be set out in our open space strategy, and some of which I've highlighted today. Partnership with state agencies, organisations like the Civic Trust, other non-governmental organisations, interest groups and communities. A city needs a vision underpinned by key objectives, and I believe that this will be driven by the adoption by the City Council of a strategy for parks in 2014. Any of my dealings with the elected representatives have been very positive in this regard. I am personally very committed to conserving the historic parks of the city, and I hope that the evidence of my work is testimony to my commitment. A very important recent event, I believe, is the appointment last Tuesday of a new city manager, Owen Keegan, who I worked with in Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown, and who I know has a track record of delivering on infrastructure to support heritage, culture and parks. I'd like to congratulate the Dublin Civic Trust on this fantastic conference and its great turnout. This conference and the work of the Civic Trust is giving important impetus to the conservation of heritage parks in the city. I believe that together with a strategic focus on the part of the City Council, that we can look ahead in the short and medium term to delivering a range of improvements to visitor facilities and simultaneously enhancing the conservation status of these parks. We all want to bring our fine historic parks to a standard which is comparable to the very best of any other capital city. And finally, I just want to highlight, while I have your attention, we are doing a user study as part of our open space strategy, and you can go online and we'd like if you would fill out that study. And there's also a very interesting 12-minute film on vimeo.com in relation to the Bull Island, which we'd like to promote. Thank you very much.